Hi everybody, this is Brian Mann from Ford Expedition. I hope everybody's staying healthy and safe, and I hope you all are keeping your families safe as well. Right now I'm standing in the Loess Hills State Forest, just about 2 miles northeast of the town of Little Sioux, Iowa, and just south of a local attraction called Murray Hill. Some of you local folks may know exactly where I'm standing. But for those of you that don't, I just want to talk a little bit about the history that took place here. This place behind me, not on the river bottom there a little bit, has some history. And the history I want to talk to you about is a man by the name of Charles Larpenteur. He settled here in the mid-1850s, and he brought with him his second wife at that time, an Assiniboine Indian wife named Makes Cloud. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, a little later, about an event that took place here in the winter of 1853 and 1854. But before I get into that, let me give you a little backstory about Charles Larpenteur, where he was born, where he wandered, and how he came to arrive in this part of the country, which is now the northwest corner of Harrison County, Iowa. Charles Larpenteur was born May 8, 1803, near Paris, France. After the Battle of Waterloo, around the year 1818, Charles's father boarded a ship and sailed to America with his family and settled in Baltimore, Maryland. During the early years of his adult life, while living in St. Louis, Charles took a trip up the Mississippi River around the year 1831, intending to arrive at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. Instead, he stopped at what is today known as Keokuk, Iowa. At that time, there were a couple of trading posts and a mixture of European immigrants and indigenous people living in the area. While riding the Red Rover steamer up the Mississippi, Charles became acquainted with Maurice Blondeau, an interpreter for the Sauk and Fox Indians throughout what is now the state of Iowa. Both Charles and Maurice took a liking to each other, and it was there that Charles got his first taste of the hardened life of the mountain men and fur traders and interacting with Indians. And after a couple of months, Charles returned to St. Louis, determined to be counted among these men and experience similar adventures firsthand. In the spring of 1833, Charles signed an 18-month contract with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company for $296. On May 12th of that year, with his mule bridled and saddled, Charles, along with an old mountain man named Louis Vasquez and a party of 40 enlisted men led by Robert Campbell, set out across the plains, destined for the Rocky Mountains. That was the beginning of his career as a fur trader and living among the Great Plains Indians on the upper Missouri River. Towards the end of his life, Charles captured his adventures and everyday challenges in his memoirs, which he titled 40 Years of Fur Trader on the Upper Missouri. From 1833 until his death in 1872, Charles became a skilled fur trader and businessman, and set up trading posts in many forts throughout the Dakotas and Montana Territory. Charles's first experience trading with Indians took place at Fort William, about 2.5 miles from Fort Union, which is near present-day Williston, North Dakota. Charles, along with 30 other men, built Fort William in the late summer and fall of 1833, on the spot where the Fort Buford sawmill later stood. Fort Union, known as Big Fort by the Assiniboine Indian chief Gaucher, was Charles's most notable trading post and where he spent his early years as a fur trader, and then again towards the end of his life. Charles started out as a clerk working for Mr. Kenneth McKenzie. His first duties consisted of ensuring the fort gates were open in the morning and locked at night, plus ensuring tools and harnesses were kept in order and in their proper places at day's end, and lending a hand elsewhere as needed. Charles was later put in charge of leading Mackinaw boats full of furs down the Missouri River to St. Louis, and later overseeing construction of Fort Alexander and additional posts in the upper Missouri region. Throughout his many years a fur trader, he established trading posts at Fort Benton, northeast of Great Falls, Montana, Fort Vermilion, northwest of present-day Sioux City, Iowa, on the South Dakota side of the Missouri River, and Fort Stewart and Galpin in northeastern Montana. From his first Green River rendezvous to wintering in Woody Mountain, narrowly escaping many close calls with hostile Indians, trips back to the States, and returning again to the upper Missouri River territory on steamers for more business ventures, Charles began to yearn for a place to call his own, to raise his family and live out the remaining years of his life. His attention was soon turned towards the Loess Hills of western Iowa. In 1851, while Charles was living at Fort Vermilion with his family, he heard of good and cheap land claims on the Little Sioux River in what is now western Iowa. Charles then took his family by steamboat to Sergeant Bluff, Iowa, from where he planned to stage his departure from the Missouri River and venture across country to his intended new land claim. Charles sent his clerk to inspect a specific land claim he learned of that, by description, appeared to suit his needs for a place to settle with his family and to farm. When his clerk returned and provided a first-hand description of the land, Charles set out the next day, and upon arriving, he made the purchase and took ownership of the land claims. Charles then returned to Sergeant Bluff and made preparations to move his family and belongings to their new homestead. Charles bought 4 Indian ponies, 2 French carts, and hired a guide for $2 a day to pilot him through the watery and swampy river bottom. In early June 1851, Charles and his family, led by his guide, departed for the 50-mile journey to their land near the mouth of the Little Sioux River, arriving exhausted after nearly 7 days of pushing through water, swamp, and mud. For centuries, the Little Sioux River, known by the Sioux Indians as the Stone River, flowed freely down the river valley, taking the path of least resistance as it wound its way through the bottom soil to join up with the Missouri River. It wasn't until 1947 that a flood control and soil conservation program known as the Nepper Watershed Project diked up and tamed the river. These old maps from 1884 and 1922 both show where the Little Sioux River once flowed. In comparison to a present-day satellite image, you can still see evidence of the old riverbed. Charles's cabin is believed to have stood somewhere near the red dot marker on the present-day satellite map image. The exact location is believed to be just north of and above the White Shed, within the small grove of trees near the west side of the road. His farmland surrounded his cabin, extending out onto the Little Sioux River bottom. And it is believed that Charles constructed a bridge over the Little Sioux River here, where the present-day gravel road crosses over the old riverbed. This bridge was no doubt used by Charles on his later journeys to and from the upper Missouri Territory. Though Charles had become owner of a rich land claim near the mouth of the Little Sioux River, closer to the States, he was no less out of Indian country. Charles had numerous dealings and close calls with many of the Great Plains Indian tribes during his years on the upper Missouri. He experienced good business as well as found both friend and foe among the Sioux, Blackfeet, Crow, Assiniboines, Rees, Chippewas, and Cree Indians. On many occasions, he encountered hostile bands of Indians and thought it was his time for going on up, as he put it. Charles learned how to talk his way out of many skirmishes and soon became esteemed in high regard by both the men he lived with as well as the Indians who crossed his path. In the Loess Hills of western Iowa, and near the land claim Charles settled on during the early 1850s, the presence of Indian tribes consisted primarily of Little Sioux, Omaha, and Potawatomi Indian tribes. These tribes were living in this area many years before Charles arrived. Deer and buffalo were plentiful, providing sustenance for these nomadic cultures for centuries. If you know where to look, you can still find buffalo cuts in the Loess Hills today. The Omaha, pronounced Maha, and Potawatomi had formed an alliance years earlier to fight and defend against their mutual enemy, the Sioux. After the Battle of Smith Lake in the mid-1840s between the Omaha Potawatomi tribes and the Sioux, in which the Sioux were defeated badly, the Sioux forever relinquished all claim to the right bank of the Little Sioux River. Thus, they were compelled to stay and hunt north and west of the river, and the Omaha and Potawatomi tribes would live and hunt south and east of the Little Sioux River. But on several occasions, the Sioux would venture across the river to hunt or raid and attack the Maha villages. And it was on such an occasion that resulted in the death of Charles's second wife, an Indian woman named Makes Cloud. Though Charles had finally found a place to settle and call home, he was often called upon by the American Fur Company to return to the forts on the upper Missouri River to manage general business affairs and oversee trading that continued to occur between the fur trappers and the Great Plains Indians. In the spring of 1853, Charles returned home from Fort Vermilion, just west of present-day Sioux City, Iowa. He had rented his farmland out to a local farmer who put in a fine crop of 40 acres on well-broke and fenced bottom ground. The increase of settlers passing through on their way to Utah, Oregon, or California was on the rise. This did not deter the Omaha Indians from continuing to hunt in their old hunting grounds around Charles's land. Charles always kept a few trinkets to trade with them, as they often stopped by his cabin for a smoke of the pipe. Around midwinter of 1853-1854, a party of Sioux Indians had gone to war with the Omahas and killed 4 braves in a battle nearby. It was a bitter cold winter day, and on their return they passed by Charles's place and resigned to camp on the banks of the Little Sioux River, not far from Charles's cabin. After settling in at their camp, a few young braves went hunting and killed a deer in the timber just south of Charles's field. They took with them what amount they saw fit to feed themselves and the rest of their party. On their way back to camp, they stopped at Charles's cabin and talked with Charles's wife, Makes Cloud, who they knew and could communicate with. Makes Cloud was an Assiniboine who once were part of a larger culture of Sioux Indians during the 1600s and 1700s in Ohio. The Sioux warriors told Makes Cloud they had hung the balance of the deer meat in a tree a short distance from their cabin, and she could have it if she was so inclined. Early the next morning, the band of Sioux departed the area and headed back north. Around midday, once the weather lifted some, Makes Cloud said to Charles she was going after the meat. Charles said, "Do as you please." At that time, Charles had engaged the services of a couple hired hands to help him build a bridge across the Little Sioux River. While Charles was alone at his cabin, his hired hands out of sight in some timber cutting down trees for the bridge, and Makes Cloud was in the timber south of their fields searching for the deer meat, a party of 6 Omahas approached his cabin. From their appearance, Charles soon learned they were in pursuit of the Sioux war party, and were alarmed by his wife, Makes Cloud. Though they knew her well, they knew she was also a Assiniboine and therefore belonged among their Sioux enemies, as they spoke the same language. Charles did his best to induce the Omaha warriors to stay long enough for Mixcloud to return home and near his protection. The Omahas were in a hurry, and as they stepped away, Mixcloud appeared out of the timber about 300 yards south of the cabin. Mixcloud had her 18-year-old daughter with her, and when she saw the Omahas approaching them, she said, "My daughter, we are lost." She knew their customs and rightly concluded her time had come. Upon meeting her, they shook her hand, and then the next thing Charles heard was the report of a rifle. They shot Mixcloud through the heart, and she dropped dead in an instant. One of the Omaha warriors wanted to also kill her daughter, but another said, "We have killed her mother. That is sufficient." The Omaha warriors ran off soon after and disappeared, back on their pursuit of the Sioux war party. I have often wondered where Charles buried Mixcloud. I frequently return to the beautiful Loess Hills near Little Sioux and climb up the highest ridge lines to gaze out across the Missouri River bottom from atop the highest point and wonder if she's close by. Soon after arriving at his new land claim in 1851 and building a more suitable house for Mixcloud and his children, a small party of Omahas came to trade. Unbeknownst to Charles, the Omahas had the smallpox. Within a couple weeks, Charles's youngest child, a small boy, contracted the disease and died 3 days later. In the spring of 1852, Charles made arrangements with Mr. Peter H. Sarpy to go up to Running Water, known today as the Niobrara River in northern Nebraska, and take charge of the trading post there for the Ponca Indians. In September of that year, Charles received news that more of his children had died. Years later, after many more callings to the forts on the upper Missouri, Charles lost his 25-year-old daughter on September 1st, 1866. The following February, his son, Charles Jr., died at the age of 23. Charles would end up outliving all of his children. He returned one final time to the upper Missouri in 1870. His travels this time were made more difficult due to a broken leg he suffered in June of 1869. He had a splendid establishment at Fort Buford and made out quite well with his family. The progressive expanse of both business and politics finally caught up with Charles. He learned that Congress passed a bill allowing but one post sutler, thus ending his appointments at forts in the upper Missouri. Charles would lose another daughter in February 1871, and on the 14th of May, Charles and his family headed back to their farm near the Little Sioux River for good. On the 9th of December 1871, Charles's last child, his 12-year-old son Loess, died of inflammation of the lungs. Charles closed out his memoirs, 40 Years a Fur Trader in the Upper Missouri, with the following. 40 years ago was my first winter in the Indian country at Fort William, when the stars appeared to fall. That my lucky star fell is plainly to be seen in this narrative. Whether there are any such stars may be a question, but there is not question of my being out of luck. On November 15th, 1872, Charles passed away and is buried in an old, small, hidden cemetery about 500 yards to the east-southeast of where his cabin once stood. Since the time Charles and his family walked the land nearby, the homestead and cemetery have been known as Fontainebleau, a name given by Charles in reference to the small town he was born in near Paris, France. Charles was married 3 times throughout his life. His first 2 wives were Assiniboine women. Where the first wife is buried is not known. Mixcloud, his second wife, is likely buried somewhere near the old homestead. Charles's third wife, Rebecca Bingham, passed away on the 28th of March, 1899, and is buried beside Charles in the old Fontainebleau Cemetery. The memory of their lives will forever be a part of this beautiful place where the Loess Hills touch the old Little Sioux riverbed in western Iowa. Well, I'm going to call that a wrap. I hope that you enjoyed this little history lesson about the man named Charles Larpenteur, the old fur trader, and his Assiniboine Indian wife, Mix Cloud, and the beautiful country that you'll find here in the Loess Hills of western Iowa. So if you found this video interesting and you really did like it, please click that like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Forward Expedition. That's 4WD Expedition. Until next time, I'll talk to you later, folks. Bye.